Welcome to this deep dive, the tragic death of Daunte Wright. It's a story that continues to raise important questions about policing accountability race in America.
Absolutely.
We have a variety of sources for you today.
Yeah.
Court documents, news articles, personal accounts. And if you'd like access to any of them, just reach out to us. We want to help you understand this case beyond the headlines to see the nuances in the broader context.
Yeah, it's a case that has deeply affected a lot of people and sparking outrage, grief, and calls for change. And it's important that we approach this conversation with the seriousness and the sensitivity it deserves.
Absolutely. So let's begin by going back to April 11, 2021 in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota.
Okay.
Daunte Wright, a 20-year-old black man, was driving his car when he was pulled over by police.
Right. The initial reason for the stop, according to police reports, was expired registration tags and an air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror.
Wow. It's hard to believe that something as seemingly minor as an air freshener could lead to such a devastating outcome.
It's a tragic illustration of how quickly a routine traffic stop can escalate,
Right.
particularly for Black Americans who are disproportionately targeted for these types of stops.
Yeah, during the stop, officers ran Wright's name through their database and discovered an outstanding misdemeanor warrant.
The warrant stemmed from a gross misdemeanor weapons charge, allegedly carrying a gun without a permit. There were also reports of a protective order against him, but the details of that are not entirely clear.
Okay, this is where things took a heartbreaking turn as officers attempted to arrest Wright. A struggle ensued.
Right. Body camera footage shows Officer Kim Potter, a 26-year veteran of the force, shouting, "Taser, taser, taser," repeatedly. But instead of deploying her taser, she fired her handgun, striking right in the chest.
The footage is incredibly disturbing to watch. It shows the stark difference between Potter's bright yellow taser and her black handgun.
Yeah.
The fact that she was a training officer,
Right.
someone who allegedly instructed others on taser use,
Yeah.
makes this mistake even more difficult to comprehend.
Potter claims she mistook her gun for her taser.
Right.
A defense known as slip and capture. This argument suggests that in high-stress situations,
Yeah?
cognitive overload can lead to these kinds of unintentional errors. However, the prosecution argued that a trained officer with Potter's experience should have been able to distinguish between the two weapons, especially given the visual and tactile differences.
Yeah, it's a defense that has been met with skepticism by many, especially given the clear differences between the two weapons, and sadly, this tragic mistake cost Daunte Wright his life. He drove off after being shot but crashed a short distance away and was pronounced dead at the scene.
Yeah, it's a devastating loss, leaving behind a young son and a grieving family. And to make matters worse, this occurred during the already emotionally charged trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. Just miles away, this heightened tensions in the community and added to the collective trauma and grief.
Yeah, the timing of this incident so soon after George Floyd's murder really ignited the national conversation about police brutality and racial injustice. It also raised questions about the training policies and culture within police departments.
Organizations like the ACLU pointed to this case as another example of the dangers of pretextual stops, where minor traffic violations are used as a justification to stop and question individuals, often disproportionately. Targeting people of color data from the Stanford Open Policing Project supports this concern, showing significant racial disparities in traffic stops across the country. We have that data for you if you're interested.
It's clear that this case touched a nerve, forcing us to confront some difficult truths about policing in America. And it's important to acknowledge that while we support our law enforcement officers and the difficult jobs they do, there must be accountability when tragic errors occur.
Absolutely.
Reforms are also needed to address systemic issues and prevent future tragedies.
Accountability and reform are not mutually exclusive with supporting law enforcement. In fact, they are essential for building trust between police and the communities they serve.
And part of that accountability is ensuring that victims of police misconduct and their families have access to legal recourse.
Yeah. Suing for justice while it can't bring back a loved one is a crucial step in holding individuals and institutions accountable.
Right.
Seeking compensation for damages.
Right.
And pushing for policy changes to prevent future tragedies.
And we'll delve deeper into the legal aspects of this case later in our deep dive.
Now let's turn to the legal proceedings in the Daunte Wright case, following public outcry and intense scrutiny. Officer Kim Potter resigned from the force and was charged with second-degree manslaughter.
This was a significant development as it signaled that authorities were taking the case seriously and pursuing charges against the officer involved.
That charge was later upgraded to first-degree manslaughter, recognizing the gravity of the situation and the potential for a more severe sentence if convicted.
The trial took place in December 2021, just a few months after the incident. It was a highly publicized trial with cameras allowed in the courtroom due to COVID-19 restrictions.
This provided the public with unprecedented access to the proceedings, allowing them to witness the arguments, evidence, and testimonies firsthand.
And before we dive into the details of the trial, we want to remind you to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on future deep dives like this one. We appreciate your engagement and your commitment to understanding these important issues.
Now, back to the trial. The prosecution presented a case focused on Potter's actions and her alleged negligence in mistaking her gun for her taser. They emphasized her extensive training and experience as a police officer, arguing that a reasonable officer in her position should have known the difference between the two weapons.
They also highlighted the clear visual and tactile differences between the taser and the handgun, suggesting that Potter's actions were reckless and demonstrated a disregard for human life.
The defense, on the other hand, argued that Potter's actions were a tragic mistake, a slip-and-capture error that occurred in a high-stress situation. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about the phenomenon of these types of errors,
Right?
suggesting that even experienced professionals can make unintentional mistakes under pressure.
The defense also emphasized Potter's emotional state after the shooting, portraying her as remorseful and devastated by the outcome.
The jury was tasked with weighing the evidence and determining whether Potter's actions constituted criminal negligence or manslaughter.
And in the end, after days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict.
Let's pause here for a moment and delve into the complexities of the jury's decision-making process. They had to carefully consider the legal definitions of manslaughter,
Right.
the evidence presented, and the arguments made by both the prosecution and the defense.
They had to grapple with the difficult question of whether Potter's actions, even if unintentional, met the legal threshold for criminal culpability.
And their decision ultimately would have significant implications for both Potter's future and the broader conversation about police accountability. And their decision ultimately would have significant implications for both Potter's future and the broader conversation about police accountability.
We left off with the jury deliberating in the trial of Kim Potter. This was a pivotal moment in the case with so much hanging in the balance.
Yeah. The nation was watching, waiting to see whether the justice system would hold a police officer accountable for a fatal mistake. And for the family of Daunte Wright, it was a time of agonizing anticipation, hoping for some measure of justice for their loved one.
After days of deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict.
They found Kim Potter guilty on both counts of manslaughter, first degree and second degree.
It was a significant verdict, sending a message that even unintentional acts by law enforcement can have serious legal consequences.
The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some praised it as a step toward accountability, while others felt it was too harsh, given that Potter had maintained her innocence and claimed it was a tragic accident.
Daunte Wright's family expressed relief and gratitude for the verdict, but also emphasized that it wouldn't bring back their son.
Their pain and grief were palpable throughout the trial, a stark reminder of the human cost of this tragedy.
The sentencing phase was equally emotionally charged. The prosecution pushed for a sentence that reflected the severity of the crime and the need for deterrence.
They argued that Potter's actions, even if unintentional, demonstrated a disregard for human life and warranted a significant prison term.
The defense, however, pleaded for leniency, highlighting Potter's remorse, her lack of prior criminal history, and her long career in law enforcement.
They painted a picture of a dedicated officer who made a terrible mistake, not a malicious or callous individual.
Ultimately, the judge sentenced Kim Potter to 2 years in prison.
This was a departure from the prosecution's request for a longer sentence, but the judge emphasized the unusual circumstances of the case, stating that it was not a case of intentional malice, but a tragic error in judgment.
The sentencing sparked debate, with some feeling it was too light, while others believed it was appropriate given the specific circumstances of the case.
It's important to note that Potter ended up serving 16 months of her sentence before being released on supervised release.
This case really highlights the complexities of the criminal justice system, especially when it comes to holding law enforcement accountable. There are so many factors to consider, and the outcomes can often feel unsatisfying, leaving both sides with a sense of injustice.
And this case, unfortunately, is not an isolated incident. We've seen a pattern of police officers involved in fatal shootings, particularly involving Black Americans, with varying levels of accountability and justice.
It's a pattern that demands our attention, our critical thinking, and our commitment to advocating for change. We need to push for reforms that address systemic issues within law enforcement, improve training, and ensure that officers are held accountable for their actions.
Absolutely. And it's important for us to remember that we can all play a role in demanding justice and advocating for reform. We can educate ourselves about these issues, engage in constructive conversations, and support organizations that are working to make a difference.
And don't forget, one powerful way to hold individuals and institutions accountable is through legal action. Suing for justice can provide a measure of accountability and compensation for damages. And it can also force institutions to implement changes to prevent future tragedies.
It's a crucial tool for achieving justice and ensuring that those in power are held responsible for their actions.
Now let's shift our focus to the aftermath of the Daunte Wright incident and the actions taken by the city of Brooklyn Center following the shooting. There were widespread protests and calls for reform.
The city, recognizing the need for change, implemented a number of policy changes aimed at improving police-community relations and reducing the potential for future tragedies.
One significant change was the implementation of a cite and release policy for certain low-level offenses.
This means that instead of arresting individuals for minor offenses, officers are now encouraged to issue citations and allow individuals to appear in court later.
This policy is designed to reduce unnecessary arrests, especially for offenses that don't pose a significant threat to public safety.
It also aims to reduce the number of interactions between police and citizens, particularly in communities of color that are often over-policed.
Another important change was the city's decision to invest in alternative public safety programs.
This included allocating funding for mental health response teams, trained to handle situations involving individuals experiencing mental health crises.
The goal is to provide a more compassionate and effective response to these situations, recognizing that traditional law enforcement tactics are often not appropriate or helpful.
The city also invested in community outreach programs aimed at building trust and communication between police and residents.
These programs provide opportunities for officers and residents to interact in positive settings, building relationships and fostering understanding.
The City of Brooklyn Center also reached a $3.25 million settlement with Daunte Wright's family.
This financial settlement, while it can't bring back their son, provides a measure of financial support and acknowledges the city's responsibility for the tragedy.
It's also important to recognize that Kim Potter, after serving her prison sentence, began giving presentations at law enforcement conferences about the incident and the concept of slip and capture errors.
This has been met with mixed reactions. Some see it as a genuine effort to educate other officers and prevent future tragedies, while others view it as an attempt to profit from a tragedy or minimize the gravity of her actions.
It raises complex questions about accountability redemption and the role of law enforcement in addressing its own failings.
It also highlights the ongoing need for open dialogue and critical thinking about how we address these issues and work toward meaningful change.
Now let's take a step back and look at the broader implications of the Daunte Wright case, how it fits into the national conversation about police reform, and what lessons we can learn from this tragedy.
This case, along with many others, has brought the issue of police brutality and racial injustice to the forefront of our national consciousness. It's forced us to confront some difficult truths about our society and the systemic issues that perpetuate these injustices.
It's also sparked a movement for change with demands for police reform accountability and a reimagining of public safety that prioritizes community well-being and justice for all.
One of the key takeaways from this case is the devastating impact of implicit bias.
Implicit bias refers to the unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that we all hold often without even realizing it.
These biases can influence our perceptions, judgments, and actions, even when we believe we are being fair and impartial.
And in the context of law enforcement, implicit bias can have deadly consequences. Studies have shown that implicit bias can contribute to racial profiling, excessive use of force, and the disproportionate targeting of Black and brown individuals by police.
The Daunte Wright case, where an experienced officer mistook her gun for her taser, raises questions about how implicit bias might have played a role in her perception of the situation and her decision-making.
It highlights the need for comprehensive training programs that address implicit bias and equip officers with the tools and strategies to recognize and mitigate their own biases.
Another important lesson from this case is the critical need for de-escalation training.
De-escalation techniques are designed to reduce the intensity of a situation, to calm things down, and to avoid the use of force whenever possible.
This involves active listening communication skills, empathy, and the ability to recognize and respond to cues that might indicate a situation is escalating.
De-escalation training can help officers to approach situations with a more mindful and measured approach, reducing the likelihood of confrontations turning violent.
And in the Daunte Wright case, many have questioned whether better de-escalation techniques could have prevented the tragic outcome.
It's impossible to know for sure, but it's clear that de-escalation training is essential for creating a safer environment for both officers and the communities they serve.
Now let's consider some of the broader policy changes that are being advocated for in response to cases like Daunte Wright's.
One significant area of reform is the call for stricter use of force policies. One significant area of reform is the call for stricter use of force policies.
These policies outline when and how officers are authorized to use force, and they aim to limit the use of force to situations where it is absolutely necessary to protect life or prevent serious injury.
Many advocates are pushing for policies that emphasize de-escalation, require officers to exhaust all other options before resorting to force, and hold officers accountable for any use of force that is deemed excessive or unjustified.
Another important area of reform is the push for greater accountability and transparency within police departments.
This includes measures like independent investigations of police shootings, the creation of civilian review boards to provide oversight of police conduct, and the establishment of national databases to track police misconduct and use of force incidents.
These reforms aim to ensure that officers are held accountable for their actions, and that there is a system in place to address complaints and identify patterns of abuse.
And importantly, many advocates are pushing for a shift away from the traditional law enforcement model toward a more community-oriented approach to public safety.
This involves investing in community-based programs, social services, mental health resources, and economic opportunities that address the root causes of crime and violence.
It's about recognizing that policing alone cannot solve these complex societal issues. We need to invest in communities, empower individuals, and create a more just and equitable society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
We've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into the Daunte Wright case, from the initial traffic stop to the trial and sentencing of Kim Potter and the City of Brooklyn Center's response.
Now let's step back and consider the broader societal implications of this tragedy, the ongoing challenges to police reform, and what the future might hold.
This case, unfortunately, is not an isolated incident. It fits into a larger pattern of police violence against Black Americans, a pattern that has been documented for decades.
The names of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile Tamir Rice, and so many others are etched in our collective memory, a stark reminder of the systemic racism and injustice that pervades our society.
These cases have sparked outrage protests and calls for change, but they've also revealed deep divisions within our country, with some defending law enforcement while others demand radical reform.
It's a complex and emotionally charged issue, one that requires nuanced conversation and a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
One of the most contentious issues in the debate about police reform is the concept of defunding the police.
This idea, which gained traction after the murder of George Floyd, proposes redirecting some funds from police departments to other community-based services like mental health crisis response teams, social workers, and violence prevention programs.
Proponents of this approach argue that it would allow for a more holistic and effective approach to public safety, addressing the root causes of crime and violence, while reducing the reliance on armed police officers.
They point to the fact that police officers are often called upon to handle situations that they're not equipped to deal with, like mental health crises, substance abuse issues, and homelessness.
Critics of defunding the police, however, argue that it would weaken law enforcement and make communities less safe. They contend that police officers are essential for maintaining order, responding to emergencies, and protecting citizens from crime.
This debate highlights the need for a more nuanced conversation about the role of law enforcement in our society and how we can create a system that is both effective and equitable.
It's also important to recognize that police reform is not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah.
Different communities have different needs and different challenges, and there is no single approach that will work everywhere.
Reform efforts need to be tailored to the specific circumstances of each community, and they should involve input from residents, community leaders, law enforcement officials, and other stakeholders.
One of the most significant obstacles to police reform is the resistance from law enforcement unions and organizations.
These groups wield significant political power, and they often defend officers accused of misconduct, oppose efforts to increase accountability, and push back against reforms that they see as threaten their authority or autonomy.
Overcoming this resistance will require building coalitions, educating the public, and holding elected officials accountable for enacting meaningful change.
Another challenge is the deeply ingrained culture within many police departments, a culture that often prioritizes loyalty over accountability, discourages whistleblowers, and protects officers who engage in misconduct.
Changing this culture will require strong leadership from within law enforcement, as well as external pressure from community members and elected officials.
It's a long and difficult process, but it's essential for creating a system where officers are held accountable for their actions and where misconduct is not tolerated.
The Daunte Wright case, and the countless others that have come before it, has sparked a national reckoning on race in policing in America.
It's forced us to confront the systemic racism and implicit bias that permeate our society, and it's challenged us to reimagine what public safety could look like.
This is not just about individual officers or individual incidents. It's about a system that has been designed to protect some at the expense of others.
It's a system that needs to be dismantled and rebuilt, one that is rooted in justice, equity, and respect for the dignity of all people.
We're at a critical moment in our nation's history. We have a choice to make to continue down the same path, a path that has led to so much pain, suffering, and injustice, or to choose a different path, a path that leads to a more just and equitable future.
It's a path that requires courage, compassion, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. It's a path that will not be easy, but it's a path that we must take if we want to create a better world for ourselves and for future generations.
And as always, we encourage you to like, comment, and subscribe to stay informed about future deep dives like this one. And remember, if you've been affected by police misconduct or know someone who has, pursuing legal action can be a powerful way to hold those responsible accountable and advocate for change. Don't hesitate to reach out for support and information about your legal options. There are organizations and resources available to help you navigate the legal system and fight for justice.
And as always, we appreciate your engagement and your willingness to delve into these complex and important issues.
Thank you for joining us.